Hello and welcome to the latest Quarantine Quarto, brought to you by the Shakespeare Institute, spiritually in Stratford-upon-Avon but dispersed a little bit more widely just for the present moment. My name's Simon Smith. I'm a lecturer here at the Shakespeare Institute in Shakespeare and early modern drama. And I want to talk to you today about Hamlet, but also a bit more broadly about stagecraft in the play and in drama of the period, approaching that question through the staging conditions, the audience culture of the late 16th and early 17th century. Now, this might seem like a slightly unexpected approach to take to a play like Hamlet. For a start, it's got probably the most famous ear in any of Shakespeare, given that is how the poison is poured into the natural gates and alleys of old Hamlet's body, setting in motion the events of the play with his murder. But perhaps in more significant terms, to take an approach such as this, I think departs from a lot of recent work that's approached Hamlet on broadly page-based terms, approaches that leave the kinds of spatial, visual and sensory stagecraft that the turn to performance in Shakespeare studies has kind of emphasised, perhaps not foregrounded quite so much. It's many decades since Alan Desson questioned the critical habit of poring over Hamlet as a dramatic poem rather than a play on stage in performance. Yet Hamlet remains really central to accounts of Shakespeare as a literary dramatist. And if we look a bit more widely, I think the very idea that an early modern play would particularly seek to stimulate the eye runs counter to one lingering scholarly narrative that seems to recur even now. And that's that Reformation concerns about idolatry and visual worship meant that in any context, whether devotional or otherwise, Elizabethans were extremely wary of setting up any kind of illusion, to quote Andrew Gurr. Prominent visual stagecraft would seem an unlikely dramatic tool for a playwright to rely upon under these kinds of conditions of production, we might think. But in fact, full consideration of Hamlet, of early modern theatrical culture more generally, and of the many and varied influences that were shaping contemporary English attitudes to sight when Shakespeare was writing, reveals, I think, a rather different picture. In truth, vision status in post-Reformation England wasn't settled, but in fact highly contested. Sensory critics now recognise that sight was a much disputed sense, sometimes doubted or denigrated, but also widely praised, and it was often understood really quite differently from one context to another. Moreover, where scholars once tended to propose a kind of all-pervasive iconoclastic anxiety about visual illusion and seduction, lasting from the 1580s onwards, more recent scholarly work has tended to emphasise instead the cultural impact of really multiple influences beyond Reformed theology, and has begun to propose slightly more nuanced relationships between the shifting religious doctrine of the period and wider visual culture, compared to the previous claims of severe visual anorexia which have been applied to this period. As Matthew Milner urges us, no longer can we stereotype Reformation sensory changes as a switch from eyes to ears. And furthermore, Hamlet's stagecraft in fact makes systematic and sustained use of sight, qualifying the recent suggestion, I think, that the play appears in some way to endorse aural over visual experience, and despite the persistence of wider theatre historical claims that much early modern drama, and I think especially Shakespeare's drama, was a primarily verbal rather than visual art form, this idea that the globe was designed for listeners, not viewers. In fact, Hamlet not only relies upon the staging of particular sites, some of these, the Ghost, the Dumb Show, long recognised as dramatically significant, but as well as this, it invites playgoers repeatedly to engage with its precise visual design, doing so through active, judicious and critically reflective looking. So as I want to explore in this talk then, vision and visual stagecraft are rather more important to Hamlet than is typically acknowledged, just as spectacle is a more substantial, sophisticated and conventional component of early modern dramatic craft than some theatre history centering on complaints about illusionistic spectacle and gazing spectators have perhaps tended to suggest in the past. So given the critical commonplace that early modern playmakers and playgoers differentiated between the common sight and the judicious ear, perhaps it would seem misguided to seek sophisticated visual stagecraft in a play like Hamlet, Even in its own period, of course, it was said to please the wiser sort by Gabriel Harvey. Scholarly understandings of differentiated sight and hearing can often be traced back in substance to Andrew Gur's field-defining and very important work, in which he often distinguishes the learned ear from the shows of the common stage, or argues that Elizabethan audiences were hearers before they were spectators, characterised by alertness to the aural rather than visual features of performance. Whilst Gabriel Egan has long since questioned the hypothesis that early modern subjects tended to speak of hearing a play instead of seeing a play, despite this, the propensity to characterise Shakespearean drama as primarily linguistic in design has persisted, as part of a bit of a general tendency, really, to oppose sound and spectacle as alternative rather than complementary dramatic modalities. These distinctions between verbal craft and judicious hearing on the one hand, and then broad spectacle and illusory gazing on the other, have tended to invite a tidy, but I think ultimately problematic sensory separation between some dramatists consciously targeting the judicious and those who, as Lucas Erne phrases it, knew they were producing little more than theatrical fast food. There were certainly distinctions drawn between Playhouse looking and listening. Ben Jonson is most often cited in this regard. So, for example, late in his career, he claimed overtly that good playgoers come to hear, not see a play, preferring to have you wise much rather by your ears than by your eyes. Yet stark generalisations based on this kind of claim simply don't reflect the full evidence. A full archival survey finds, in fact, a range of conflicting opinion, rather than a clear consensus that in the Playhouse ears were judicious and eyes were common. And in fact, quite another opinion appears to be the most popular of all, reflecting, I think, a fundamentally different understanding of plays and playgoing. And this is the idea that, in fact, good drama should appeal to ears and eyes, and that good playgoers need to engage judiciously, therefore, through both senses, not just one. In fact, even Jonson himself appears a bit more sympathetic to this position in earlier years, particularly before his falling out with Inigo Jones over the priority of Jonson's text and Jones's scenic design in court masks. During Shakespeare's working life, Jonson actually quite happily offered Epicene around 1609 as the object of your ear and sight, and as far back as 1599, he invited gracious and kind spectators to feast your eyes on every man out of his humour, with perhaps merely partial sarcasm. This trope persisted in stage prologues and print paratexts all the way through the period. So as late as the mid-1630s, Joseph Rutter's The Shepherd's Holiday presented unto ears and eyes its drama of pastoral love, whilst James Shirley's The Grateful Servant received praise for the full delight of every eye and ear, evoked by its performance in 1629. I think it's significant too that whilst this print paratext is positioning Shirley as proto-literary here, it also admires his visual as well as linguistic stagecraft. Similarly, a commendatory poem to Philip Massinger's The Bondman, performed 1623, twice claims that playgoers saw and heard as carefully as they could in the hope of understanding the play, yet also asserts that the play contains nothing to take by common way the common sight. So crucially, Playhouse looking might encompass common sight, but it follows it must be able to take other forms if this play can involve judicious looking, yet not be aimed at the common sight, according to this paratext. I think even more telling are complaints about playgoers' ill-judged attempts to engage through anything other than a balanced combination of ear and eye. So, for example, Henry Glapthorne bemoans those who attend through one or the other sense alone, or who ignore them both in order to show themselves off. And so he says, "Some in an humorous squeamishness will say, they only come to hear, not see the play. Others to see it only there have been, and are good store, that come but to be seen, not see nor hear the play. How shall we then please the so various appetites of men?" Now, of course, there are some clear overtones of frustration here at the playmaker's lack of control over the way the audiences are behaving and engaging. And I think that tells us something about how varied, individuated and unpredictable Playhouse response in any period is likely to be. But I think what we do see here in Glapthorne's prologue is echoes of a widespread and, by the late 1630s, extremely long-standing Playhouse expectation of careful sight as well as hearing, indicating this conventional combination of the verbal and the visual in its dramatic design. It's perhaps striking too that Glapthorne seems to be thinking of exclusively oral engagement as recognisably Johnsonian rather than a more general behaviour. So his satirical description of a humorous playgoer who is squeamishly fixated on hearing, not seeing the play, constitutionally imbalanced to the point of sickliness, I think is deliberately recalling Johnson's two comedies of humours and their outspoken writer. What I think is perhaps the most suggestive evidence of all, though, appears in the refutation of Thomas Heywood's Apology for Actors of 1612, or published in 1612, that is. And the refutation asks, what a doubtful case would the use of plays then stand, if none but fools, as commonly they are, or none but blind men were their auditors? The one kind could not understand, the other could not see, and consequently neither give right judgment of them. Now, simply to suggest that sightlessness results in partial experience of dramatic performance seems fairly uncontroversial, although we might want to unpick the kind of ableist discourse there from our own point of view. But I think to argue that blind men would be as unequipped as fools to give right judgment is actually to go considerably further. This seems to be suggesting to me that visual attention is not just required, but it needs to be explicitly critical and judicious in order to engage with an assessor play adequately. You have to look critically in order to judge a play. Separations between unthinking sight and censorious hearing simply don't obtain then under this model of Playhouse spectatorship. Instead, the key question is whether an engagement is actively judicious, regardless of the organ of perception. Later critical traditions privileging page over stage have shaped a modern assumption that, to simplify matters, performance tends to speak to the senses, whilst a printed text activates the intellect, as Lucas Erne influentially has put it. In early modern culture, however, this distinction between active linguistic rationality, activated by text, and passive sensory feeling, spoken to by performance, I don't think was always so clear. Visual engagement was expected to be judicious, censorious, and thinking, shaping a theatrical culture in which playgoers were asked to bear a rational and critical eye as a matter of course. Recent and seminal work by Gillian Woods takes important steps towards recovering this culture. Taking the example of the dumb show, Woods argues that such sights were neither empty of meaning nor reductively symbolic. Instead, like language, dumb shows required active critical engagement. The difference was simply that eyes rather than ears were prioritised. And so this dramaturgy of suggestion rather than didacticism in turn fostered a Playhouse culture of visually engaged interpretation and polysemous meaning. As Woods puts it, dumb shows require understanding, while simultaneously emphasising that understanding is challenging. A more engaged and censorious model of Playhouse looking in turn enables a more precise understanding of complaints about the common sight within a theatrical culture accustomed to both verbal and visual stagecraft. In fact, I think these kinds of remarks are rarely criticisms of sight and spectacle per se, but actually they're rather objections to particular kinds of unthinking or uncritical spectatorship. Thus, as we saw earlier, the Bondman could be praised both for what spectators saw and heard, and for refusing to take by common way the common sight. I think a similar distinction is at work as well in the printer Richard Jones's claim that certain fond and frivolous gestures that have been of some vain-conceited fondlings greatly gaped at in performance are excised from his edition of 1 and 2 Tamburlaine of 1590. Strongly implying passive, unthinking attention, such disparaging references to gaping or gazing spectators are common, including Stephen Gosson's very familiar warning that the longer we gaze at theatrical shows, the more we crave. Significantly, this terminology has specific theological connotations in an early modern context, just as someone like George Hakewill imagines Catholics gazing upon their dumb ceremonies. So Playhouse references to gaping and gazing spectators are deliberate attempts to equate visual passivity in the playhouse with idolatrous looking. Thus, and this is Gosson again, if we flock to the theatres to gaze upon plays, we walk in the counsel of the ungodly, not only lacking discretion, but visibly reminiscent of a practicer of idolatry. And so I think it's this specific mode of looking, passively gazing upon an illusory, seductive sight, rather than critically engaged scrutiny with precise visual stagecraft, that early modern commentators are warning against when they complain about playhouse looking. And it's really crucial then, I think, that such strictures are not taken to preempt the possibility of a thoughtful, precise, even rich visual playhouse culture. So I hope that in what I've said today I've given a bit of a sense of the culture of looking and of visual stagecraft in the early modern playhouse, and perhaps raised a few questions about some of our traditional assumptions in this regard. Join me for part 2, when I will turn specifically to Shakespeare's play Hamlet, to think in a bit more detail about precisely what this wider culture of judicious looking might mean for the stagecraft of one particular play.